are few places on planet Earth with such majesty and such ruggedness as the Rocky Mountains. Home for centuries to wildlife that evolved specifically to meet the needs of life in this tough region of North America, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado were finally tamed by humans with the advent of one technology. The first to dare to not only cross the mountains, but to challenge them. To carve its way through solid rock, to climb the steepest mountains and dare the narrowest cliffs. The railroad. Introduced to North America in 1829, the young network of steel rails did not reach the Rockies until the first Transcontinental Railroad reached the mountains in 1868. Never before had the surveyors and engineers responsible for planning and building the nation's railways faced such a challenge. To tackle the steep cliffs, the narrow ledges, the extreme distances and grades presented by the Rockies. For some, the answer was obvious: narrow gauge. While most railroads in the U.S. were built to a standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails, many railroads in the Rocky Mountains opted to build smaller railways, with the track gauge built to a mere 3 feet between the rails, in order to fit onto narrower cliffs, tighter turns, and stricter construction budgets than their standard gauge counterparts. Built by the Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville Railway, and operating between the towns of Georgetown and Silver Plume, Colorado, stands an engineering marvel of the 1800s, the 1884-built Georgetown Loop Railroad. The towns sit only 2 miles apart, but by rail, it's a journey of 4.5 miles, which climbs 640 feet in elevation, tackling grades as steep as 4%, ascending 4 feet for every 100 feet of track traveled. By contrast, railroads consider grades of 2% and greater to be steep. Railroad was completed in 1884 by the Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville Railway. The route twists and winds its way through the steep and very narrow Clear Creek Canyon on its brief but challenging climb from Georgetown to Silver Plume. The route changed hands to the Colorado and Southern in 1893, who operated the line until its closure in 1938. In 1939, the line would be ripped up. But the story of this rugged stretch of railroad would not end here. In 1973, thanks to the efforts of the Colorado Historical Society, work began on rebuilding the line with the intent of using it as a steam-powered tourist railroad. On March 10, 1984, the Georgetown Loop Railroad opened. The route curves around in a horseshoe after departing Georgetown, completely turning around before reaching the scenic highlight of the short but rugged journey, the Devil's Gate High Bridge. 95 feet off the valley floor below, Traversing the Devil's Gate still garners the same reactions of shock and awe at the view, and the height, as the original did in 1884. The original drew tourists to the area in the 1880s and into the 1930s. Now, with the new bridge and rebuilt route completed in 1984, the modern-day Georgetown Loop Railroad is as much a tourist draw as it was 143 years ago. While the bridge might be the most iconic point along the line, the short Georgetown Loop Railroad has much more to offer beyond the Devil's Gate Bridge. With the steady beat of Engine 111's exhaust, the train marches up grade towards Silver Plume and Hall Siding, where the Silver Plume-bound train passes the Georgetown-bound train. The sound of the whistle announces 111's arrival at the Hall Siding. The siding track allows the second train to pass the first on the single-track main line. The number of tourists hauled by this little railroad necessitates the two trains in order to keep up with demand. Even from the side of a nearby highway, the 111's exhaust is drowning out nearly all other noise as she battles the steep grade. As the locomotive and train ascend the grade further, the route passes the old Lebanon mine, where the railroad offers mine tours. The Lebanon mine was bored in the 1870s and was used for silver mining. Treacherous grades and daunting heights are not the only challenges faced by the railroads that operated this line. In the month of February in the 1880s, and again in 1904, came multiple reports of train cars being blown over onto their sides in powerful gales in the Clear Creek Valley. One news article from 1904 wrote, "Railroad train blown from track near Georgetown, Denver, February 2nd. A news special from Idaho Springs yesterday says, just as the morning passenger train was entering Georgetown at 11:45 this morning, it was overthrown by a strong gale. The two coaches and combination baggage and express car were overturned, falling on their side on the south side of the track. There were 25 people on board. Only one of them was severely injured." Beyond the mine, the track cuts into the rock before crossing Clear Creek once more. The steep grade offers little reprieve for the old steam engine as the train nears the sharp curve at high fill. 111's crew has to not only battle the grade with the engine's raw power, but balance the many mechanisms and appliances of the 111 in order to give the engine the power needed to tackle the grade. Where the engineer's focus is on maintaining traction on the grade and the smooth, safe descent down the grade, the fireman must focus on sustaining the engine's water level and a hot, efficient fire to supply the engineer with the steam needed to power up the grade, yet not so much to set the engine's safety valve off frequently. It's a fine balance of artistry between the two men and the machine. The arrival in Silver Plume marks the halfway point of the journey, where the engine is run around the train in order to reverse down the steep grade back to Georgetown. The art and skill of descending the grade with hundreds of tons of steel is no less impressive than the Herculean effort to ascend the same grades. The men and women of the Georgetown Loop Railroad make this journey nearly daily, a journey 141 years old, through terrain thousands of years older still. The near incomprehensible skill and daring of all those who came before them to build and rebuild this stretch of treacherous railroad, not lost on any of those responsible for operating and maintaining the railroad today. The Rocky Mountains of Colorado do, however, have many more geographical challenges for the daring 3-foot gauge railroads to face. The geography becomes no less rugged 310 miles to the southwest. Durango, Colorado, home to the famed Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad, a route steeped in history and geography. A route 45 miles long through the Animas River Gorge, below snow-capped peaks high above the tree line, through dense forest and rocky outcrops. One of 2 survivors of the legendary Denver and Rio Grande Western's narrow gauge system. The engines here on the DNS are also former DNRGW equipment, just as the route is. Right at home, these husky, outside-frame 282 Mikado types are well suited to the terrain ahead. Solid rock walls blasted through by brave track crews in the 1880s to lay the narrow rails to Silverton. Narrow ledges high above the canyons below. It's hardly a journey for the faint of heart today, let alone those who laid the rails 142 years ago. The narrow gauge system survived up until 1968 as a freight carrier, carrying freight and tourists with the very steam power present on the DNS today. These images, captured in 1961 by Don Kell, show the tourist operations on the Denver and Rio Grande Western, from Durango to Silverton. The line became a successful tourist draw thanks to the creation of the highway system which doomed the freight business. It now carried tourists from the town of Durango to ride the narrow gauge system to Silverton, a route made more popular through multiple Hollywood features. To this day, the Durango and Silverton remains a popular tourist draw, and the same old steam locomotives march out of the Durango depot, bound for the town of Silverton. Words completely incapable of preparing one for the journey ahead. After departing Durango, the train crosses the Animas River and follows it closely out of town. Waterfront features are a defining characteristic of this route. It's easy to see, even in the first few miles of this journey, why it draws in so many riders. Highway 550 parallels the track here, a reminder of modern civilization. A reminder that ends as the train exits the town of Hermosa and crosses the road at the grade crossing, and breaks away, beginning the climb into the San Juan Mountains. The bark of the old steam locomotive's exhaust becomes sharper, louder, as she digs in to tackle the grade. The thin gray stream of smoke turns to a thicker black, as the fireman sands the flues to keep them clean and clear of obstruction, ensuring proper drafting for the fire and good efficient steam production to enable the old iron horse to handle the rough climb ahead. High above Shalona Lake, the rise in elevation is now very apparent to those aboard the train. The approach into Rockwood signals the final signs of civilization for miles. The station stop at Rockwood is the last accessible point between here and the town of Silverton. a distance of 28 miles. After the brief stop to pick up more passengers, the train departs Rockwood, bound for Silverton, deep into the wilderness. The trackage ahead, some of the most scenic and most rugged in North America. Through the rock cut, the train will enter the San Juan National Forest, and the first views beyond will tell the tale of the brave men who dared to carve this railroad from solid rock. The Highline, a nearly 400-foot drop to the Animas River below. This wonder of 19th century engineering was constructed in the winter of 1881 to 1882. The narrow ledge the railroad sits upon blasted from solid rock using dynamite. Reports claim the cost to build this wondrous stretch of railroad were as high as $1,000 per foot in some places. The construction workers who built this marvelous feat of engineering over 140 years ago did so suspended by ropes, dropped down from the rim of the canyon above. They drilled by hand the holes to insert the dynamite into the rock face, lit the fuses, and had to be removed from the blast zone before detonation. Remarkably, there were no fatalities in the construction of this treacherous stretch of railroad. Even 400 feet below us, the sounds of the shallow waters of the Animas River rushing between the rocky walls of the canyon are just as audible as the sounds of the brakes on the train carrying us. Venturing deeper into the canyon and further from civilization, the journey becomes serene. The quiet tranquility of nature, a perfect contrast to the loud iron beasts that carry the vassals of human civilization through this wilderness. Crossing the Animas River again at milepost 477.8, the old bridge dates back to 1887. This is a location known as Cascade Canyon, once known as Teft on the Rio Grande, named for early forest ranger Guy Teft. Distance, the peaks of Needles Mountain Range loom at over 13,000 feet. The rocky, barren peaks well above the tree line. The highest peak in this sub-range of the San Juan Mountains, Wisdom Peak, at a staggering 14,093 feet above sea level. The route the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge traverses today was originally part of the Denver and Rio Grande Western's San Juan extension, stretching from Alamosa, Colorado to Durango, and eventually reaching Silverton in 1882. The 45 miles of rugged railroad that would become the Silverton branch were completed in only 9 months, allowing the narrow gauge network to reach the rich mineral deposits surrounding the town of Silverton. The railroad, built in such a haste, has many sharp curves and was poorly graded when constructed. Fortunately, the nature of the 3-foot gauge equipment tasked with traversing this route is far better suited to handling such difficult conditions than their standard gauge counterparts, an important element that no doubt led to the survival and continued operation of this scenic yet difficult section of the former DNRGW. Prior to the railroad, and prior to the settlement by Europeans, the region was part of the Utes Indians' territory, who settled the region by 1500 CE. The Utes' first contact with Europeans came in the 1700s, with the Spanish, though sustained contact would not begin until 1847 with Euro-Americans. The dangers and trials of mountain railroading in the Rocky Mountains did not end here after construction ended, nor after the close of the steam era. To this day, the Durango and Silverton must battle the elements to keep the railroad running. Here we see the aftermath of a recent rock slide. Thousands of tons of rocks slid down the mountainside and covered the tracks, damaging them and forcing the railroad to temporarily shorten operations. Still on site, an excavator used by the railroad to clean up the rock slide sits waiting for railway workers to resume clearing debris, now clear of the tracks. The final miles of our approach to Silverton see the canyon narrow, the steep rocky walls getting ever closer. The geography of the canyon and the uphill battle against the grade offer an excellent auditorial demonstration of the old iron horses that dare to challenge the Rocky Mountains. the rushing waters of the Animas as our foreground, and the snow-capped peaks of the Needles Mountains as our backdrop, the final march into Silverton is a timeless scene of America's industrial era.
By the Rocky Mountain, down by the old oak tree, the girl I love so dearly has turned her back.
We have arrived in Silverton. Founded in 1874, the town of Silverton was built to serve the silver veins and budding mines that dotted the area, including the Sunnyside Mine, which was among the longest-running mines in Colorado, finally closing in 1992. With the mines long since closed, modern-day Silverton relies on the riches of tourism instead of gold and silver. The sound of the iron horses barking their way into town is a staple of Silverton, both today and during the mining era. Train after train will pull into town, dropping off hundreds of tourists into a town with a population of only 622. Surrounded by high peaks, the town is, aside from the arrival and departure of the iron beasts, a quiet town. The old Silverton Depot stands the test of time and is a monument to the days gone by on the DNRGW, and the dedication of the San Juan Historical Society, who owned the building when a charge of dynamite was set off in the southeast end of the depot at approximately noon on September 12, 1975. No one was injured, and no one was ever convicted with the crime. The depot, fortunately, was repaired and saved. After completing the layover at Silverton, the trains returned to Durango, one by one, beginning the long downhill trundle from the old mining town back into the wilderness, separating them from the rest of the world. Nearing the edge of the wilderness, we look down the cliff to the Animas River at the bottom of the nearly 400-foot drop at the Highline. The view no less breathtaking the second time as the train hugs the narrow cliffside. The crossing lights at Highway 550 signal the return to civilization. Crossing Highway 550, the railroad enters Hermosa, the final stretch of the return to Durango. As the sun sets, the arrival at the Durango Depot ends the journey over the Silverton branch. Only one of two surviving segments of the former DNRGW's 3-foot gauge rails. 157 miles down the road, we reach the small town of Antonito, Colorado, one of two terminuses of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, another surviving segment of the Rio Grande's famed San Juan extension. Powered by a fleet of former Rio Grande Mikados, much like the Durango and Silverton, the journey from Antonito starts early in the morning, with the longest and highest narrow-gauge steam railroad in the United States lying before them. Crossing the route even today is no easy task. "64 miles down the track, on the other side of the railroad, sits Chama, New Mexico, home to the Cumbres and Toltec's other terminus. At the same time as the Antonito train's departure, the same scenes are taking place in Chama. The two trains to meet at the halfway point, Osier. The final days of revenue freight over the Rio Grande narrow gauge took place here on the San Juan extension, largely carrying pipes and other supplies for the oil and gas boom of the 1950s. By 1960, even this business had nearly dried up. Come 1966, a mere 20 trains ran over this line in the entire year, and the following year, abandonment paperwork was filed. With the exception of the line from Durango to Silverton, the future looked bleak for the narrow-gauge Rio Grande. Fortunately, a group of railroad preservationists and locals banded together to save the most scenic portion, the 64 miles from Chama to Antonito. In 1970, the states of Colorado and New Mexico took ownership of the route, and in 1971, tourist operations began. At the crossing of the river Rio Chama, we follow the Chama departure as it begins the climb toward Osier, the Rocky Mountains ahead affording some of the most scenic views and some of the most difficult track conditions imaginable for a railroad. The depot at Chama sits at 7,860 feet in elevation, only 13.4 miles from the highest point at 10,015 feet, Cumbres Pass. The climb to reach the pass, a ruling grade of 4% at Windy Point, is no easy task for the steam locomotives of the Cumbres and Toltec, often necessitating a double header to make the grueling climb. Route 17 parallels the railroad tracks near Chama, offering motorists many opportunities to pull over and watch the old steam engines rumble by, an opportunity many rail fans to the area won't pass up. About 4 miles outside of Chama, the train crosses the 340-foot-long, 100-foot-tall Lobato Trestle, which crosses Wolf Creek just south of the Rio Chama. The open ranch lands approaching the Route 17 grade crossing provide for seemingly endless open views of the valleys and mountains surrounding the area. A rather stark contrast to the tight and almost claustrophobic canyons along the Durango and Silverton's portion of the same San Juan extension we are following here in New Mexico. Now in Colorado, at the Cresco siding and water tank, the engine must work hard, her thunderous exhaust drowning out all other sounds in the woods as they pass the site where a section house and bunkhouse once stood, servicing the men of the DNRGW's Maintenance of Way Department. The narrow gauge from Chama, New Mexico to Antonito, Colorado crosses the Colorado-New Mexico border 11 times over the course of its 64-mile winding route. As the train passes in the foreground, in the distance is Windy Point, the steep 4% grade curling around the mountain pass to the summit at Cumbres Pass. But before the train reaches this iconic point on the route, it must twist and wind its way through the Rockies some more, as it steadily gains elevation with each foot of railroad travel. The nearly unmistakable, steep, rocky walls of Windy Point betray the arrival at this iconic location. The grade so steep, it becomes apparently visible even from on board that the train is tilted upwards, climbing the mountain. The depot at Cumbres Pass sits at a staggering 10,015 feet in elevation. An astounding 2,155-foot climb from our starting point in Chama, less than 14 miles down the tracks. The grades beyond Cumbres Pass are easier, allowing for the helper engine to be cut off and return solo to Chama, while the road engine and train will continue their journey to Osier. The engine crew takes this time to inspect and oil their locomotive before resuming the journey. The climb they just tackled, one of the most storied and difficult in railroading. Immediately after departing Cumbres Pass, the train descends the grade into an area known as Tanglefoot Curve. This area is an iconic location on the Rio Grande, producing many mesmerizing images over the decades of long trains strung out through the winding curves that enable the train to descend the grade here to a lower elevation at the bottom of the valley. Over and over again, left and right, the train curves and twists its way down grade. Views of the train from on board and line side are plentiful. Continuing downgrade into the valley, the train reaches a point known as Los Pinos. At this point on the line, the battles against Old Man Winter were a thing of legend. The railroad would use rotary snowplows, steam-powered machines with massive spinning blades that would clear and shoot snow off the track. The rotary plows were refueled with coal here, and saw a great deal of use in this stretch, where snowdrifts were, and still are, known to reach 20 to 30 feet deep. Stories of engines and trains completely buried beneath the icy snow, with the crews surviving in the cabs from the warmth of the locomotive's fire alone, paint the picture of narrow-gauge steam railroading on the DNRGW in the steam era. Truly a battle against the elements. To this day, the houses that dot the area are left vacant in the winter months, the area inaccessible and largely buried beneath the snow. In the valley between Los Pinos and Osier, the train quietly rolls through the windy lowlands before climbing to Osier. The tracks follow the Rio de los Pinos River for nearly the entire climb to Osier Station. This far from civilization and the roadways, all that is heard is the wind and the distant rattle of the train on steel rails. The railroad here passes through many different ranches. Sheep and cattle dot the landscape. Many of the populations are free roaming, as there is little in the area to prevent their safe and efficient travel. As the train begins to climb again up Osier Mountain, the valley floor becoming further and further below, another iconic sight on the line nears. The 137-foot-high Cascade Trestle, the highest bridge on the line. The tiny creek that passes below the trestle is Cascade Creek, which feeds into the Rio de los Pinos immediately after passing beneath the bridge. Spotted briefly in the distance, the red-roofed structure is the Osier Station, which our train will reach through more twisting, winding curves. The sounding of the whistle signals our arrival. The old depot, section house, and water tower still stand. The new lunch hall immediately after is where the passengers will detrain and eat lunch before resuming their journeys. Here the train from Antonito will meet the train from Chama. Passengers here have the choice to return to their point of origin or continue onwards to see the rest of the line. Osier sits in Colorado, like the rest of the line, right on the Colorado-New Mexico border. From here, we will follow the journeys of both trains as they return to Chama and Antonito, respectively. After the train from Chama arrives and the passengers have detrained, the train from Antonito pulls into the depot on the far track with the engine from Chama. The locomotives swap trains and return to their starting points, each one's train continuing on to tour the rest of the line as passengers either change trains to return to their starting point or view the rest of the line from their original seats. On the journey to Antonito, our train departs Osier, headed for the Toltec Gorge, and into the bad weather looming ahead. In the distance, on the far side of the valley, we can see the Chama-bound train exiting the valley in the opposite direction, heading for better weather. Moving deeper into the mountains, the Antonito-bound train passes through more rock cuts, the terrain becoming more and more rocky as the Toltec Gorge nears. The weather seems to mirror this part of the trip. Foreboding, darker clouds gathering. The sky begins to open up as thunder rolls through the mountains. The steep, rocky cliffs into the Toltec Gorge below are a dramatic sight, and it is considered one of the sheerest drops in the United States. Below is a 600-foot drop to the bottom of the gorge. Just before plunging into the darkness of Toltec Rock Tunnel, the Garfield Monument stands, erected as it was in this spot in 1881, where a wagon load of passengers first learned of President James A. Garfield's assassination.
Got the door.
On the other side of Osier, back in the valley at Los Pinos, the Chama-bound train barks up grade, nearing the water stop at the Los Pinos water tank. The mountainous route is challenging for the old iron horses, requiring many water stops along their arduous journey. Back on the Antonito-bound train, we've exited Rock Tunnel, and the weather has turned for the worse. Thunder claps in the skies in all directions, and hail pelts down in a fury. Storms of this nature are not uncommon here, just another testament to the power of Mother Nature in this wilderness. In stark contrast to the weather over the Antonito train, the Chama train trundles along under clear skies after departing Los Pinos on the approach to Tanglefoot Curve and Cumbres Pass. The old section house once used for the railway's track workers stands at Cumbres Pass, preserved, as many others along the CNTS route are. Once more back aboard the Antonito-bound train, the storm has passed. With skies still darkened, the train's crews clean up in the wake of Mother Nature. The departure from Cumbres Pass begins the steep downgrade trek for the Chama-bound train. The downgrade trip, just like the Georgetown Loop, arguably no easier a task for the trains and their crews than the uphill battle. We return to the Cresco water tank again, this time for the passing of the train downgrade. Much quieter than the uphill ascent of the double-headed K-36s. Winds kick up as the train passes Rancho del Oso Pardo on its long downgrade trek. As the train passes, one can hear and see the brakes at work to control the train's downhill fall, with smoke from the brake shoes filling the air as the train clears the crossing. Under sunnier skies now, the Antonito train nears a station known as Sublet, located in the ghost town of Sublet, New Mexico. The small section house, once used frequently for the track crews on the Rio Grande, now stands almost completely quiet, no longer used to house track crews. The train stops briefly for servicing, and then proceeds onwards to Antonito. From here, the line will continue to descend into the desert. Flora and fauna gradually change as the train nears the desert. The landscape becomes more open, mountains vanishing into the background, trees becoming less and less frequent, small shrubs dominating the lower elevations. Still, the grades here are too steep for the train to tackle directly. More twisting curves lower us into the desert, crisscrossing the Colorado-New Mexico line several more times. If one didn't believe this mountainous railroad could possibly lead to the desert before the end of its 64-mile run, the views at the Bighorn water tank should settle any disbelief. Crossing Lobato Trestle on the return to Chama, Engine 484 nears the end of her journey on the far end of the line. The quiet trundle downgrade in the evening sun, seemingly a reflection of the end of the journey. Twin flames. As one train pulls into Chama, the other arrives at Antonito. Separated by 64 miles of narrow rails, the two trains pull into the depots connected by a shared history. The journey over the old Rio Grande narrow gauge ends with these twin arrivals. In total, over 113 miles of narrow rails through these Rocky Mountains are still dominated by the bark of an old steam engine. Views and trials unparalleled in modern railroading. These are the 3-foot gauge railroads of railroad legend and lore. The railroads that dare to challenge the Colorado Rocky Mountains.